a little bit about Dennis. Dennis, though a mariner, is speaking as a member of RINA. His career began in 1966, very good year for the World Cup, as a deck cadet in P&O's tanker company, Trident Tankers. He followed a deck officer progression mainly in that company and its later incarnation as P&O Bulk Shipping to master and ashore as cargo superintendent and eventually to chief marine superintendent until 2001. In the seagoing years, he also served offshore aboard rig supply and anchor handling ships, but also general cargo ships and road-packed ferries. Between 2001 and 2008, he worked as a consultant, marine and risk consultant, and in the same period was a flag state nautical inspector and accident investigator for the Bahamas Maritime Authority. He also worked as an expert witness in the UK and USA. His prolific submissions of defect reports from ships, pointing out aspects of design that were less than suitable for purpose, led in 1980 to management challenging him to do something about the issues as cargo superintendent. I think everybody knows if you suggest that something is wrong, you tell us how to fix it, which is part of probably tonight's presentation. His interest in ship design first stimulated in the 1970s during studies for HND nautical studies led to joining RINA as an associate in 1980, followed by the Nautical Institute and RIN. Work in the UK delegation at IMO on bulk carrier safety led to a fellowship in the Nautical Institute. RINA, and he says to his surprise, elected him a fellow in 2019. Not too much of a surprise, I think. He is a member of the RINA IMO committee, actively engaged at IMO on working groups looking at SOLAS. And as we all know, SOLAS is probably part of this. Dennis will give his presentation and will respond to any questions at the end, here and online. So without further ado, Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm sorry it was a bit late. Originally, this was supposed to go out last year sometime, but a few hospitalizations and things in between have prevented it happening. So we've ended up where we are. Most recently, I got sick again just at the wrong moment. But here we are. We'll try and get it out properly off the mark this time. I thought I'd start by picking up on the 1966 bit, because 1966, apart from the World Cup, when it was won, I was on a sailing ship in the middle of the North Sea on the way back from the tall ship race. We just finished and we won it in our class. I'm very pleased with ourselves. And it was as a sea cadet. And then 1 month after that, I found myself on a Trident tanker for my first trip. And the day after we sailed, we had the compulsory lifeboat drill. And I remember going up, it was green as grass because of first trip cadet, going up onto the boat deck and watching this thing, suddenly this huge thing, which seemed almost as big as the brigantine, which I've been racing in a few weeks before, went crashing out and swinging and banging and crashing. And I can remember thinking to myself, you could get killed doing this. But in those days, you didn't used to, because the boats were the old-fashioned open boats, and people knew what they were doing, and they could do things without being hindered by all the technology which has come along since. I haven't actually changed my mind. You can still get killed doing this, and therefore, and then we've come a long way since those times. Although the basic principles of the lifeboat haven't really changed, but that's the lifeboat. And what I'm talking about here tonight is not so much the lifeboat as how to get it in and out of the water. Because the lifeboats, if you drop them in the water from a great height, and there's one of you, I was watching a YouTube video yesterday of one that got dropped as it was being lifted into the water. The bridle broke, as they do, and the boat swung itself down, landed in the water upside down, but then immediately turned itself right and was right way up. I just hope there was nobody in it, because it would have been a rough ride. Now, so I better go in and start at the beginning, which is a bit of history. So you'll probably be surprised by this because we're talking about free fall boats tonight, but to get there, we ought to go through the history. So first, can you see that? British Trent, which is a tanker, BP tanker, in 1993, had a collision with a ship going into Antwerp, and there were 9 people lost their lives. The ship had a big fire. As you can see from the picture there was the tugs did a good job of trying to get things under control. But if you look very closely on the starboard side of the ship, which is stern onto us at the moment, you would just see a lifeboat, possibly 2, hanging halfway down. And this is how the people lost their lives. They got into the lifeboat, and some of them didn't actually reach the lifeboat because there was too much smoke and fire on deck. And they ended up having to jump out of the lifeboat, and they jumped into the sea, which unfortunately was on fire. And a lot of people were saved by heroics, by the pilot boat who was on the scene at the time. They drove the pilot boat straight into the fire and picked people up and got some out. But unfortunately, 9 people still lost their lives. So the lifeboat really didn't do its job because they didn't get it into the water. And they also had a problem in getting to it in the circumstances. So let's move on a bit. So from that, and there were a few other incidents, but that was the one that really sticks in the mind. How survival craft developed since that time? Well, they were actually developing before that, but they're things that which we're looking at, enhancing the safety of occupants in the survival craft by enclosure. So someone thought we better put a roof over the top, because then they're in a safe environment. That also serves the purpose for exposure in nasty, in extreme weather. So that seemed like a good idea. And so enhance the potential for fast escape. That is getting off the ship quickly. How to make them get into the water quicker. We'll come to that. For tankers, during the escape, once clear the ship, of course, we're talking about fire and of course heat and fumes. And so they thought about this, well, we'll give it a water spray and cool the whole thing from the outside. They should stand and then have its own air supply inside, which is a compressed air supply. Then people should have a chance of survival. Good thinking. And that's what you end up with. Now that is a familiar type of boat to me because we had them, a lot of them in P&O when I was there, and they were a nightmare. Any mariners who are watching this will know what I'm talking about, I think, because whilst it does all those things which I've just talked about, and you can see the spray rails around the top for cooling it and making sure it can get out of it. It's got no decks, and if it's got no decks, that makes it very difficult for the seafarer inside. That hatch at the after end is a classic because that opens up inwards. And the design we had, which is the same as this one, if it opens up inwards, it immediately comes up against the helmsman's seat. So it can't open properly. The only person who can get through it is a little tiny Filipino sailor who can't actually reach it because the height of the hatch from where he was. So we had to, now as we installed an extra deck, we took the helmsman's seat and put it on hinges so that they actually could handle the lifting gear at the after end there. And the forward end has got a similar hatch, which is also equally dangerous because once you're stuck in that hatchway, you take the boat away, having disconnected it nicely at the bottom, and you're coming back, you've got one great big hook, which is big, heavy piece of metal swinging around, trying to take your head off. And you cannot retreat from that position. You're stuck there, like a guy sticking out the top of a tank. So that is not very good thinking. Another thing you think about it, how do you get people in and out of this when you're being rescued? So you're away from the ship. All right, you've got everybody up there alive. Helicopter comes in, they want to take people on. And it's very difficult because the only access is through the side. So it's like from one side door of the helicopter to another side door in a crowd, which is not easy. If you talk to a helicopter crew, they don't like it. And the people on the MSC Napoli had to use one of these, a similar boat to this, not this same craft, and they closed themselves in the western approaches, and the helicopter had a terrible time getting the people off. But when they did, half the guys they were fitting well when they went into the boat. They spectacular piece of seamanship getting it away, and then they nearly died from heat and dehydration and all those sort of things, because they got them into Truro eventually, but saved their lives. But these were fit and well, healthy seafarers with all their certificates for their fitness, and they nearly died. So the enclosure thing needs a bit of careful thought. It's not the be all and end all of everything. Let's move on. Meanwhile, all of this was happening. Other things were happening in a sort of parallel industry called the offshore industry. And they themselves were facing a problem, as this one that sticks in your mind, 1988, Piper Alpha. Most people know about that. And a lot of people died here. It's 167 lives lost. It was a horrendous incident. And the reason they lost their lives was because they couldn't get away from the fire. And so in that industry, they started looking at ways of getting survival craft that could launch very quickly and get them away from the craft. So what do you end up with? A lifeboat that falls off the ship. Now, please forgive my graphics. They're pretty rudimentary, but the idea is to try and keep things simple so you can see what's going on. These guys, they run along the top deck or on the bottom deck, and they get up a long tower to a boat that's pointing down sort of 40 degrees, 50 degrees angle, jump inside, strap themselves in, facing aft, most of them, except for the helmsman, who's ready to bash his teeth out on the wheel. But he doesn't have to sit there. He can sit in the aft-facing seat as well, which is what I used to advise them to do. And away they go. And so when that happens, off you go, and it all goes down nicely into the water, dives in, turns around, comes out like a whale, and there we go. But there we go. How do ships sink? Well, you can see on the stern of this ship, which a lot of people will recognize. I won't name names here because it's controversial. There's a lifeboat. You can see it there, and it's a freefall lifeboat. But you notice something about it? The ship isn't nice and level in a port. It's offshore in the ocean waves, and it's slightly to one side. It's not because it's a big Capesize ship. It doesn't lean very far, so you haven't got much of a heel on it. But it certainly gets a trim on it because, as you can see from the explosion forward, that's all the bulkheads going in, and the remains of the cargo blowing out the top, and some very big spaces filling up quickly, which is what most cargo ships will have the same configuration, so they don't sink straight. So what could happen from that angle? Well, one thing is what we call over rotation, because the boat going down the slope won't go down quite as quickly, because gravity being what it is fixed, but the resistance to gravity is increased by this angle. And so you end up with a situation like that. Now the boat starts to tip and rotate as it's supposed to do by design, but it's not going quite as fast as it was before. So it's rotating faster than it would have done before. And it goes down at a rather steep angle. And what can happen then is it carries on over. It has happened. There's a fairly good YouTube, which if you want to look it up, it's called Front Flip Lifeboat. And the boat goes into, I won't try and show it here because that's asking for trouble because the technology. But just look up on YouTube Front Flip Lifeboat and you'll see this boat doing this. And there were people inside and it went clean over the top and came back down. It landed nicely in the water. It had a bit of a heel on it. And eventually it drifted away, and the door came open, and rather bewildered looking little crew member came out. We don't know what the condition of the people was inside the boat. It's never been reported, as far as I can find. The ship's identity remains a bit of a mystery, although I know what the flag was. Now, that last picture we showed of the ship going down, there was a lifeboat in this petition. If it was delayed, because the person on board very wisely thinks, well, hang on, we can't launch because we're not going at quite the angle we thought. And I don't know how much that comes into the training, but certainly all the people that I've met in various investigations and inspections that I've done have all said the same thing. And you said, well, what happens when the ship dives by their head? They said, well, can't get the boat away. So they understand that they can't get the boat away. And so I said, well, what will you do instead? And too many of them said, not all of them, too many of them said, I will just jump in the sea, which is lethal because you jump in the sea and you've then got the problem of finding something to float you out. And so I said, well, why not just stay on board? What? Stay on board? So, well, yes, because the boat will go up the ramp as easily as it goes down the ramp, driven this time by buoyancy rather than gravity. But nobody has got a free fall lifeboat, which they say will do float free. Some will say that you can have this done with special, you can have it adjusted in such a way with hydrostatic releases. Nah, it will float on its own because there's about 30 tons of buoyancy in the average lifeboat, which when you try and immerse it, it's not a pressure vessel, it's not going to stay down, it's going to come up. And that ship, which went down, the whole film of it, which I've got, if you watch the film very carefully, you will see in the distance a number of things break free as it goes down. One of them is the funnel housing, which breaks off, floats for quite some time. But the other thing that comes up in the distance is a little thing which looks suspiciously like a lifeboat. And that would make sense because the fastenings on that lifeboat would not be able to resist that buoyancy. It may get damaged in the process, but I would say stay on board. When the ship tilts past the neutral point, then release the boat and wait for it to go. Now that's one way of dealing with the problem, but it is not part of the training, and I feel it should be. What's the other problem? Back to the problem we had in the British Trent, smoke and that sort of thing. Well, you can get this boat away. This is one just been lowered into the water in the way that most masters that I've ever met prefer to do, lower it over the stern. With a tanker, it's not likely to be sinking if it's on fire. It's probably going to stay put. So therefore, this method of launching would seem to make sense. And in fact, free fall launching also would make sense. But how do you get to the boat? Right, well, you've got to go out on deck. And sometimes you've got to run up several staircases to get to the boat. And I've looked at models in well-known shipping companies, some of them who are extremely experienced in tankers and have had accidents and know about these things. And they all built like this. They all built with a boat packed on the after end and no means of getting to it undercover. So what to do about it? Anyway, it can go, as you can see, and it can go away and get away quickly, and it can do what it's supposed to do and go on, away we go. That's good. But you've got to get into that boat in the first place. So to move on, why not stick an airlock in? It's usually tacked on fairly close to the after end of the accommodation. Why not have a tunnel and an airlock so that you can go from the inside of the accommodation, which on a tanker is usually pretty well isolated from the outside, can be, and go all the way to the lifeboat and get in from there. Nobody seems to have thought of this. Nobody seems to have come up with the idea. I'm coming up with it now. I challenge somebody who's building ships to try and do this, because there are some boats are really close to the accommodation on ordinary cargo ships. Tankers, they tend to be further away for some reason. I'm guessing it's to do with the position of the engine room. Okay, so we move, and if we get them safely on board, all the same things can happen, and away goes the boat, and you can come away. So tankers, we can see a fairly easy way out. But a lot of what happens if you want to get it away by some other means? Well, this has got an idea which Peter Jenkins and I have been working on, which I've said, well, instead of having the slope on the ship, why not just lift the whole lot over the side, have a gantry which is able to lower the boat. We go back a bit. Well, I could just go back. There, well, that one. See that gantry? It was with that extra cantilever in the end. It can get down to the water, and the boat can get into the water from there as though it was running off a slipway. And there's no pendulous effect on the falls. The falls, the longer they get, the more they become susceptible to synchronizing with any movement on the ship. And any master will tell you, I'm sure a few others as well, that when a ship, as soon as it lets go of the ropes, it probably starts moving in roll, pitch, heave, these various other things. When you're in the open ocean, it definitely does move. And yet you won't find anything about roll, pitch or heave in SOLAS. So we're revising chapter 3 at the moment. I'm hoping that we can get that into it. Start being realistic, because you don't, if your ship is in port, there's usually a good way to get off the ship. It's not by a freefall lifeboat, it's down the gangway. So that is what we'd like to see. And so even if the ship does tilt, I'll get quickly ahead. Oh, right, come back. To that point there, you can still lower the thing and get it away. You can actually, on the way down, still let go of the thing and still launch by free fall when you get a bit closer to the water. But some of these free fall lifeboats on the small ships, it isn't a very big drop at all. So the chances of that over rotation occurring is quite minimal. But on these bigger ships, there's a big difference, and you can end up with an over rotation, and well, you could do more damage than good. So that's what we'd like to get to. Well, free float launching. Well, there are some people who are expert at this, and they've been doing it for a long time. How do they ever get a lifeboat away from the shore? They never, ever try dangling it from a crane. The last thing they do is dangle it from a crane. They always drive it in with a very waterproof tractor usually, or let it run down a slipway. And I've seen there's some very good YouTube footage and a good program on the BBC, Saving Lives at Sea, which shows you these things being launched in the most horrendous conditions. And they even get them back, which impresses me. So I thought, well, why not borrow from this? Because that's where we need to get to. So how do ships sink? Let's go through it again. If you flood the engine room, what does the ship do? It sits deep in the water. It'll go a bit by the stern, but it won't sink. But if you flood the compartments forward of the engine room, and most cargo ships I'm talking about, most of the cargo compartments are forward. These are the biggest spaces on the ship, and it will go in one direction only. The loss of buoyancy will occur forward, down flooding will occur in the foremost compartments, and the ship will first settle by the head and then gradually increase its forward trim until the engine room bulkhead collapses, when it will plunge in a steep incline by the head. And even tankers do that, because there's a couple of really good photographs. One of the Erika, which was a tanker which sank in the Bay of Biscay, and another one of the Prestige, which is another tanker which sank in the Bay of Biscay. And they both went down vertically. And in fact, the picture of the Erika was taken from a helicopter in those days. And you can see one of the conventional lifeboats floating off, free by itself, which kind of proves the point. The idea, what got me interested in float free, and it came into the formal safety assessment of bulk carriers, which I was a project manager on, was a piece of film that was sent me by the Royal Navy from their helicopter base down in Cornwall. And it showed them rescuing people off the stern of a handy-sized cargo ship, which was going down by the head in the way we described, but they had deck cargo in the form of containers. And these containers were floating off quite freely. And we felt like shouting to the people in the film, get on the container, because it's a lot safer than going up on that bit of wire. And even the helicopter people said that. But, you know, it's too late. They've got to go up on the wire. So I still think float free, after all, many a master will tell you the best lifeboat is the ship until it sinks and is gone. Until that time, the best place to be is on the ship. Don't get off too quickly. So that's the way I'd like to see it done. Now you see that we've got the new arrangement in with the cradle there, and if it went down so quickly that you couldn't get the thing over the stern, well, so be you still got this option. All is not lost. Will they work? Well, as they are at the moment, they work in port. They work in the shipyard, but I'm not convinced they work in a seaway. They might work after a fashion, but I think it hasn't been thought through properly. What I'd like to see is more thought going into how you actually get that boat safely into the water. And if it means waiting for the water to come up to you, then so be it. And people have said to me, oh, well, this is going to be a terrible time because you're having to wait around for that. It's going to be anxious, they're going to be very anxious by that. Well, since when was getting off a ship not a cause of much anxiety? It's not, I mean, even an exercise is for me. I've been down in many lifeboats because when I'm doing an inspection, I don't expect people to do things that I'm not prepared to do myself. So I've been down several times. People think it's a bit strange that the inspector goes down in a lifeboat, but you see a lot more that way. And what you see is a lot of anxious faces. And when you have a little debrief at the end of it, and you ask them, and they tell you straight what they're frightened of. They're frightened of hooks giving way. They're frightened of the boat not forming on the way down, but not with the boat itself. It's the actual launching process that scares them. So that's what we want to do. The cradle is the idea is that you lift the slope out into the water. The cantilever or whatever method you use of getting the gantry to go down lower, so it's over the side, but we can see me on the camera, rather than up there, reduces your pendulous effect, so you can get more control over the boat. And the cradle, by the way, the boat can then, when you're doing exercises, you can reverse the boat into the cradle like a well-fended dock, hook it up, and then lift it out. And that is a lot easier than trying to manipulate the thing into the frame of the ship, which might actually be moving a little bit. It doesn't need to move very much to make it almost impossible to get it back into the frame where it normally sits. But if you've got a cradle which is close coupled to the gantry, as it would be in this case, it is going to be a lot more positive for getting back. That's for exercise purposes. But in terms of evacuation, you've got three methods. You've got the method of launching by free fall from the top, as in the original design, lifting it in and launching it from the cradle. And the third method is waiting for the water to come up to you when the ship sinks so fast you can't get anything. Another subject is bulk carriers and small coastal ships which sink so fast that you haven't got time to get the lifeboat. That's another story. I'd love to talk about it sometime. We haven't got time now. But that again, it involves float free, but not in this form. So that, gentlemen and ladies, is what I'm talking about when I say that there's a safer alternative. I do believe there is a safer alternative. And if you want to see some of those films where there's two of them, the one that's the front flip lifeboat is definitely worth a look if you haven't already seen it. I think most people have by now. But the other one is the Stella Banner, which the ship which was scuttled off Brazil, and that big ship I showed fairly early on, and that makes for an interesting look because things were floating free that were never intended to float free, like the funnel housing. So it makes you think, and that's what I was saying, that bulk carriers are a different issue. Most people who died on bulk carriers, and I studied the statistics for during the formal safety assessment, 2,000 seafarers lost their lives over a 20-year period. They did so because they died in their beds. They didn't have time to get to any lifeboats. And so that needs a complete rethink. But they have at least now got free fall boats on those ships, and they were intended to be free float as well. You don't see the word float free bandied around very much. But I'm telling you now, I've looked at all these boats, and every one of them would float free if you just let it go, because it will go up the ramp just as easy as it goes down the ramp, just as soon as you let it go. It's just driven by buoyancy rather than gravity. Buoyancy actually is the stronger of the two. So there we are. That's That's what I have to say on this subject so far.